A 6-year-old black girl asked her grandfather with Alzheimer's for a hug. When he looked at her, his face turned pale as he whispered a name from his past. Sarah Johnson stood in front of her bedroom mirror, running her small hands over the yellow dress hanging on the door. Her dark fingers traced the floral patterns, each touch deliberate and careful. The fabric was worn in places, but it remained her favorite, the one she always chose for visits to Grandpa Thompson. "Sarah, honey, are you ready?" Her mom's voice carried up the stairs. "We need to leave in 15 minutes. "Coming, Mom," Sarah called back, quickly grabbing the dress. In the kitchen below, Lisa and James Johnson spoke in hushed tones, their coffee cups providing cover for their conversation. "The doctor said it's getting worse," James muttered, his hand tight around his mug. "He barely recognized me last week." Lisa placed her hand over his. "We knew this day would come. Maybe we should start looking at those assisted living facilities Dr. Martinez recommended. I just don't know how to tell Sarah." James glanced toward the stairs. "She loves those visits." Their conversation halted as Sarah's footsteps thundered down the stairs. She burst into the kitchen, yellow dress now on, but slightly crooked, one sock higher than the other. "Mom, can you help?" Sarah turned, showing the unzipped back of her dress. Lisa quickly fixed it, smoothing down the fabric. "There you go, beautiful." Lisa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Did you brush your teeth?" "Yes." Sarah bounced on her toes. "Can we go now? I want to show Grandpa my new book." James checked his watch. "We should head out. Traffic's always bad on Saturdays." The drive to Grandpa Thompson's house took 30 minutes, each mile marked by Sarah's endless questions from the back seat. "Why does Grandpa always sit in the green chair?" she asked, watching Portland's suburbs roll past her window. "Because it's his favorite," James answered, his eyes fixed on the road. "But why doesn't he get up and play anymore? He used to push me on the swing." Lisa turned in her seat. "Remember what we talked about, honey? Grandpa's mind is like a puzzle that's missing some pieces. Sometimes he forgets things. Can we help him find the pieces?" The parents exchanged glances, but said nothing. Grandpa Thompson's house sat at the end of a quiet street, its white paint peeling in places, the garden slightly overgrown. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah noticed the curtains in the front window move slightly. Inside, the house smelled of old books and coffee. Sepia photographs lined the walls, frozen moments of a family's history. Sarah always found her eyes drawn to one particular photo, a young black woman in a graduation cap and gown, her smile bright and hopeful. The inscription read Mary Thompson, class of 1985. "Dad!" James called out as they entered. "We're here." The living room was dim despite the afternoon sun trying to push through the heavy curtains. Mr. Thompson sat in his green armchair, the fabric worn smooth by years of use. His white hair caught the light, creating a soft halo around his head. He didn't look up when they entered. "Hi, Dad." James approached slowly, touching his father's shoulder. "How are you today?" Mr. Thompson blinked slowly, his eyes focusing briefly on his son before drifting back to the window. "Is it time for the mail?" "No, Dad. It's Saturday. Sarah's here to visit." Sarah stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure. Her grandfather seemed different today, more distant, his eyes cloudier than usual. But she wore her yellow dress, his favorite, the one that always made him smile. She took a small step forward. The floorboard creaked under her patent leather shoes. "Grandpa?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Can I have a hug?" The room went silent. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its tick. Mr. Thompson slowly turned his head towards Sarah's voice. His eyes, usually vacant, suddenly sharpened with an intensity that made James step forward protectively. Sarah stretched out her arms, waiting. The yellow dress caught the light, its fabric dancing with her slight movement. Her grandfather's face changed. Color drained from his cheeks as his eyes fixed on Sarah, really seeing her for the first time that day. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white against the green fabric. His lips parted, and in a voice thick with emotion, he whispered a single word that would change everything. "Mary." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, and James took another step toward his daughter. But Sarah stood frozen, arms still outstretched, not understanding why her simple request for a hug had caused such fear in her grandfather's eyes. The old man leaned forward in his chair, tears now streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Mary, is it really you? They told me. They said you were gone." Sarah's arms slowly lowered, confusion written across her young face. "Grandpa? It's me, Sarah." But Mr. Thompson wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked on the yellow dress, on Sarah's dark skin, on a ghost from his past that had somehow materialized in his living room on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. James moved quickly now, placing himself between Sarah and his father. "Dad, that's Sarah, your granddaughter. Mary's been gone for 30 years. No." Mr. Thompson shook his head vigorously. "No, she's right there. Mary's right there in her yellow dress. She always loved yellow. Mary, where have you been? Why did you leave us?" Sarah backed away until she hit the doorframe, her small body trembling. The room felt too small, too full of emotions she couldn't understand. Her mother's arms wrapped around her from behind, providing an anchor in the storm of confusion. "I think we need a moment," Lisa whispered, guiding Sarah toward the kitchen. "Let's get some water, sweetie." Behind them, they could hear James trying to calm his father, whose voice had risen to a desperate pitch. "Don't take her away again. Mary, please don't go." In the kitchen, Sarah climbed onto a chair, her patent leather shoes knocking against the wood. "Mom, why did Grandpa call me Mary?" Lisa filled a glass with water, her hands shaking slightly. Sometimes when people get older, their memories get mixed up. Grandpa saw you in your yellow dress, and it reminded him of someone he lost a long time ago. "Who's Mary?" Lisa sat down beside her daughter, smoothing the yellow fabric across Sarah's knees. "Mary was your grandpa's sister. She went to heaven when she was very young. She used to wear yellow dresses, too." From the living room, they could hear Mr. Thompson's voice gradually quieting, replaced by muffled sobs. Sarah stared at her untouched water glass, watching condensation bead on its surface. "Should I take off the dress?" she asked in a small voice. Lisa pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "No, honey. You wear whatever makes you happy. Grandpa's just having a hard day." But Sarah could feel it. Something had shifted in that moment when her grandfather looked at her and saw someone else. The yellow dress that had always been a source of joy now felt heavy on her shoulders, weighted with memories that weren't her own. In the quiet kitchen, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor, a 6-year-old girl began to understand that sometimes love and memory could be as complicated as the puzzle pieces missing from her grandfather's mind. The kitchen clock ticked away 10 minutes before James returned, his shirt collar damp with what could have been tears, his father's or his own. He found Sarah and Lisa still sitting at the table, the untouched glass of water now warm between Sarah's small hands. "He's calmer now," James said, his voice rough. "I gave him his medication. He's resting." Sarah looked up at her father. "Can I still show him my book?" James shared a look with Lisa before pulling out a chair. "Not today, princess. Grandpa needs to rest. But maybe we can look around the house a bit? There are lots of interesting things here." Sarah nodded, sliding off her chair. The yellow dress rustled as she moved, and she unconsciously smoothed it down, as if trying to make it less noticeable. The house creaked around them as they moved through its rooms. Every surface held memories. Dusty photographs, old books, trinkets from a life lived long before Sarah was born. She trailed her fingers along the wallpaper, following its faded pattern. "Dad," she called out, stopping in front of a particular photograph. "Who's this?" James walked over, his footsteps heavy on the old floorboards. The photograph showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, sitting on a porch swing. The boy's face was unmistakably a young version of James's father, but it was the girl who caught Sarah's attention. She wore a yellow dress. "That's your grandpa and his sister Mary," James explained, his voice soft. "This was taken about 60 years ago." Sarah leaned closer to the photo. "She looks like me." "Yes, she does." James swallowed hard. That's probably why Grandpa got confused earlier. In the living room, they could hear Lisa moving around, straightening things, keeping busy. The sound of a cabinet opening and closing echoed through the house. "James, Lisa's voice carried a note of discovery. You should come see this. They found Lisa kneeling by an old cabinet in the corner of the living room. She had pulled out a wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Inside, carefully preserved, were more photographs, letters, and what looked like a diary. I didn't know Dad kept all this, James muttered, sitting on the floor beside his wife. Sarah knelt between them, her yellow dress pooling around her legs. The photographs told a story. Mary growing up, always smiling, often in yellow. Her high school graduation, her first day of college. The last photo showed her standing in front of a classroom of children, a teacher's badge pinned to her blouse. She was a teacher? Sarah asked, touching the photo gently. She was studying to be one, James replied. She had just started her student teaching when... He stopped, clearing his throat. When she went to heaven? Sarah filled in, remembering her mother's words from earlier. Yes, honey, there was an accident. Lisa pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The top one was addressed to my dearest brother in elegant handwriting. She handed it to James, who held it for a long moment before carefully untying the ribbon. Dear Tommy, he read softly, using his father's childhood name. Today was my first day in front of a real class. The children are wonderful, though I'm terrified of making mistakes. One little girl reminded me of you, always asking questions, never satisfied with simple answers. Sarah sat very still, listening to her father's voice break over the words written so long ago. From down the hall, they heard a floorboard creak. Mr. Thompson stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking more lucid than he had earlier. She loved teaching, he said quietly, making them all jump. Even when she was little, she would line up her dolls and teach them ABCs. James started to get up, but his father waved him back down. I'm okay now, son. The medicine helped. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and this time his eyes were clear. I'm sorry if I frightened you earlier, Sarah. Sarah stood, smoothing her dress again. It's okay, Grandpa. Daddy showed me pictures of Aunt Mary. She was pretty. Mr. Thompson's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. Yes, she was. Inside and out. He shuffled forward slowly, lowering himself into his green chair with a soft grunt. Would you like to hear about her? Sarah nodded eagerly, sitting cross-legged on the floor by his feet. James and Lisa remained where they were, the box of memories between them, as Mr. Thompson began to speak. Mary loved yellow because it reminded her of sunshine. She said you couldn't be sad when you were wearing yellow. His voice was stronger now, carried by memories that had temporarily broken through the fog in his mind. For the next hour, he shared stories, Mary teaching him to ride a bike, Mary defending him from bullies at school, Mary sneaking him cookies when he was sick in bed. Sarah listened, captivated, occasionally glancing at the photographs spread out on the floor. But halfway through a story about Mary's college graduation, Mr. Thompson's voice began to fade. His eyes grew distant again, the clarity slipping away like water through fingers. Dad! James leaned forward. Do you want to rest? Mr. Thompson blinked slowly. Is it time for the mail? The moment was gone. The memories had retreated behind the veil of illness that clouded his mind. Sarah watched as her grandfather's gaze drifted back to the window, losing focus. Lisa began carefully returning the photographs to the box. We should let Grandpa rest, she whispered. But Sarah had one more question. Daddy, can I come back next week? James looked at his daughter, her yellow dress, her earnest face, her hands clasped in her lap, and saw both the weight and the possibility of this moment. Of course, Princess. We'll come back next week. As they prepared to leave, Sarah approached her grandfather's chair one last time. She didn't ask for a hug, but she placed her small hand on his arm. Bye, Grandpa. I'll wear a different dress next time. Mr. Thompson turned slightly at her touch, a flicker of something crossing his face. For a brief moment, his hand covered hers, warm and solid. Then it was gone, and his attention returned to the window. In the car ride home, Sarah was quieter than usual. She watched the city pass by outside her window, thinking about yellow dresses and sepia photographs and the stories held in old wooden boxes. Mom, she finally asked, as they turned onto their street, do you think Grandpa will remember me next time? Lisa turned in her seat, meeting her daughter's eyes. I don't know, honey. But what's important is that we remember him, and we keep visiting, and we keep loving him, even when he forgets. Sarah nodded, her fingers playing with the hem of her yellow dress. She had decisions to make about what to wear next Saturday, about who she wanted to be in her grandfather's fading world. But for now, she let the motion of the car and the weight of the day's discoveries rock her into a thoughtful silence. At home, she carefully hung up the yellow dress, smoothing out the wrinkles one last time. The late afternoon sun caught the fabric, making it glow like a memory of happiness, of teaching dolls their ABCs, of a young woman's dreams cut short, of a brother's enduring love. In the growing darkness of her room, Sarah whispered a quiet promise to both her grandfather and the aunt she would never meet. I'll find my own color to wear. I'll make my own memories. A week passed. Sarah stood in front of her closet on Saturday morning, looking at her clothes. The yellow dress hung at the back, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she pulled out a blue polka dot dress her mother had bought her last month. You look pretty, Lisa said from the doorway. Are you ready? Sarah nodded, slipping her feet into her black shoes. Is Grandpa going to be better today? Every day is different with Grandpa, Lisa replied, helping Sarah with her hair. Remember what we talked about? We just need to be patient. The drive to Grandpa Thompson's house felt longer than usual. James gripped the steering wheel tight, his knuckles white. They'd received a call from the nurse who checked on Mr. Thompson daily. He'd had a rough night, getting confused about where he was, trying to leave the house to pick Mary up from school. They found him in his green chair, as always. The nurse, Mrs. Martinez, met them at the door. He's been asking about Mary all morning, she whispered to James. I couldn't redirect him. Maybe seeing family will help. Sarah walked into the living room slowly. The sepia photographs seemed to watch her from the walls. Her grandfather sat in his chair, but today he was holding something, an old yearbook. Open to a page he kept stroking with trembling fingers. Hi, Grandpa, she said softly. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes cloudy. Mary? No, you're too small to be Mary. He looked back at the yearbook. Mary's teaching today. She has to teach the children. James stepped forward. Dad, it's Sarah, your granddaughter. Remember? We visited last week. Sarah? Mr. Thompson tested the name. Yes, Sarah, the little girl in the yellow dress. I wore blue today, Grandpa, Sarah said, moving closer. Do you like blue? He blinked at her dress, confusion crossing his face. Mary always wore yellow. She said it was like wearing sunshine. Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, but she pressed on. Can I see your book? Mr. Thompson hesitated, then patted the arm of his chair. Sarah climbed up carefully, perching on the wide arm. The yearbook showed a classroom full of smiling children, with a young Mary Thompson standing proudly at the front. She's beautiful, Sarah said, touching the photograph gently. My sister, Mr. Thompson said clearly, a moment of lucidity breaking through. She wanted to change the world, one student at a time. His voice cracked. But then the rain, the roads were so slick. Sarah felt him start to tremble. Without thinking, she slid off the chair arm and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. It's okay, Grandpa. I'm here. The yearbook slipped from his lap, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Mr. Thompson's body went rigid under Sarah's embrace. Mary? His voice was barely a whisper. Mary, is that really you? Lisa started forward, but James held her back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and wonder. Sarah didn't let go. It's Sarah, Grandpa, your granddaughter. But Mr. Thompson was lost in the past again. His arms came up slowly, wrapping around Sarah with desperate strength. Mary, I've missed you so much. I tried to stop you that night. I told you to wait until the storm passed. Dad, James said sharply, you're holding too tight. Sarah didn't complain, even though the embrace was almost crushing. She felt her grandfather's tears soaking into her blue dress. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson sobbed. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I was your big brother. I should have protected you. The room fell silent except for his crying. Sarah stayed still in his arms, her own eyes filling with tears she didn't quite understand. She felt the weight of a grief that had lived in this house for decades, hidden in photographs and letters and the fog of her grandfather's mind. Finally, his grip loosened. Sarah stepped back carefully, wiping her eyes. Mr. Thompson stared at her, reality and memory warring in his expression. "Sarah," he said suddenly, clarity returning. "You're Sarah, James's little girl." "Yes, Grandpa." He looked down at the fallen yearbook, then back at her. "You look so much like her. My sister. You're great Aunt Mary." Sarah picked up the yearbook, placing it gently in his lap. "Mom says she was a teacher." "Almost." Mr. Thompson's voice was steadier now. "She was going to be the best teacher. She loved children, loved helping them learn." He touched the photograph again. These were her student teaching kids. She was so proud. James and Lisa watched in amazement as Mr. Thompson stayed present, talking to Sarah about Mary's dreams of teaching. It was the longest period of clarity they'd seen in months. But like all moments of light in the fog of his illness, it couldn't last. Mid-sentence, describing Mary's favorite teaching methods, Mr. Thompson's eyes began to cloud over. His words slowed, then stopped. "Is it time for my medicine?" He asked no one in particular. Mrs. Martinez stepped in smoothly. "Yes, Mr. Thompson, and then maybe a little rest." As the nurse helped him take his pills, Sarah retreated to her parents. Lisa wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You did good, honey," she whispered. "Really good?" James knelt down to his daughter's level. "Are you okay? He squeezed you pretty hard." Sarah nodded. "I'm okay. He just missed Mary a lot." They watched as Mrs. Martinez helped Mr. Thompson to his bedroom for a nap. Before they left, Sarah returned to his chair and placed the yearbook carefully on the side table. In the car, she was quiet again, lost in thought. The blue polka dot dress hadn't protected her from being mistaken for Mary. Nothing could, it seemed. She was bound to her gray tant's memory by something deeper than clothes. "Dad," she asked as they pulled into their driveway, "can we bring some of Grandpa's pictures to our house? Maybe it would help him remember better if he saw them more." James turned off the engine. "That's a thoughtful idea, Princess. We'll ask him next time." Sarah nodded, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind since their visit. "Do you think I could be a teacher too? Like Aunt Mary wanted to be?" Lisa and James exchanged looks in the front seat. "You can be anything you want to be, honey," Lisa said. "But don't feel like you have to be like Mary. You're your own person." "I know," Sarah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "But I think I'd like teaching. I already teach my dolls just like she did." That night, as Sarah got ready for bed, she looked at herself in her mirror. She saw her dark skin, her curious eyes, her small frame in pajamas covered with stars. She saw herself, Sarah Johnson. But she also saw echoes of a young woman in yellow who had once dreamed of teaching children and changing the world. She climbed into bed, hugging her favorite stuffed elephant. Tomorrow, she decided she would ask her mom to help her set up a pretend classroom in the basement. Not because Mary had done it, but because Sarah wanted to try it herself. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered if somewhere, in the complicated puzzle of her grandfather's memories, she could exist as both, his granddaughter Sarah and an echo of the sister he had lost. Maybe, she thought as sleep took her, that wasn't such a bad thing to be. The basement of the Johnson house transformed over the next week. Sarah arranged chairs in neat rows, set up her mother's old whiteboard, and lined up her stuffed animals as students. She practiced writing on the board with her best handwriting, just like she'd seen in the photograph of Aunt Mary. "Good morning, class," she said to her stuffed audience. "Today we're going to learn about Sarah." Lisa called from upstairs. "It's time to go to Grandpa's." Sarah froze, chalk still raised. She hadn't decided what to wear today. The yellow dress hung clean in her closet, and the blue one was there too. But neither felt right anymore. "Mom," she called back, "can I wear my white dress? The one with the flowers?" Upstairs, she found her parents in another hushed conversation in the kitchen. They stopped when she entered. "The white one?" Lisa asked, already heading for the stairs. "Sure, honey. Let's get you ready." James stayed in the kitchen, staring at his coffee. Sarah caught fragments of what sounded like a phone conversation from earlier. Facility and full-time care and best options. The drive to Grandpa Thompson's house was tense. Sarah noticed her father checking his phone at red lights, her mother's hand squeezing his arm whenever he did. Mrs. Martinez met them at the door again, her face tired. He's been talking about school all morning, she said quietly, insisting he needs to pick Mary up from her teaching job. Sarah walked into the living room ahead of her parents. Her grandfather sat in his chair, but he was dressed today in a button-up shirt and tie. His shoes shined. "Grandpa," she said softly. "It's Sarah." Mr. Thompson turned, his eyes fixing on her white dress. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. She wasn't wearing yellow, wasn't matching the image in his mind. Then he smiled, and Sarah's heart dropped. It wasn't his normal smile. "Mary, you're early. I was just getting ready to pick you up from school. How are the children today?" James stepped forward. "Dad, that's Sarah, your granddaughter. Remember?" But Mr. Thompson wasn't listening. He leaned towards Sarah, his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that scared her a little. "Did little Tommy behave today? You mentioned he was having trouble with his reading." Sarah looked at her parents, uncertain. Lisa nodded encouragingly, while James watched with worried eyes. Sarah started, her voice small. "Everyone was good today." "Wonderful." Mr. Thompson clapped his hands. "I knew you'd be a natural teacher. It's in your blood, Mary. Mom would have been so proud." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't her grandfather's fault. His mind was like a puzzle with missing pieces. She remembered. Today, there were more pieces missing than usual. "Tell me about your students," Mr. Thompson continued, patting the arm of his chair. Sarah climbed up carefully, perching where she had last week. She thought about her stuffed animal classroom in the basement. "Well," she began slowly, "there's an elephant who's really good at math." "An elephant?" Mr. Thompson laughed. "Oh, you and your stories, Mary. Always making learning fun for them." For the next hour, Sarah walked a delicate line between reality and her grandfather's memories. She told him about her pretend classroom, and he wove these stories into his memories of Mary's teaching days. Sometimes he'd interrupt with his own memories, talking about incidents from decades ago as if they'd happened yesterday. "Remember when that little girl brought you an apple?" he asked, his eyes far away. "Your first teacher's apple. You called me that night, so excited." Sarah just nodded, even though she knew this memory belonged to someone else. She watched her grandfather's face as he talked, saw how happy these memories made him. Was it wrong to let him believe, just for a little while? James and Lisa sat on the couch, listening. Sarah caught her mother wiping tears away several times, saw her father's hands clenched in a fist on his knees. Then Mr. Thompson said something that made everyone freeze. "Mary," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I need you to promise me something." He gripped Sarah's hand. "Promise me you won't drive home in the rain tonight. The forecast said storms are coming. Stay at my house, please. Just until it passes." The room went silent. Sarah felt the weight of his hand on hers, saw the desperate plea in his eyes. I promise," she whispered. Mr. Thompson's shoulders sagged in relief. Good. I couldn't bear to lose you again." "Dad," James stood up, his voice rough. "I think that's enough for today." But Mr. Thompson held on to Sarah's hand. "Mary needs to stay. The storm's coming. I have to keep her safe this time." "James," Lisa said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No." James's voice was firm. "Dad, Sarah needs to go home now. With us. Her parents." The word seemed to hit Mr. Thompson like a physical blow. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and for a moment clarity flickered in his eyes. "Sarah," he said uncertainly. But Mary was just here. She was telling me about her students." Sarah felt his hand trembling in hers. "It's okay, Grandpa," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I could come back next week." "But the storm—" He looked out the window at the clear autumn sky. "I could have stopped her. I should have stopped her." Mrs. Martinez stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Thompson, it's time for your medication. And then maybe a rest?" "It's been an exciting morning." As the nurse led him toward his bedroom, Mr. Thompson kept looking back at Sarah, confusion and grief warring on his face. "Don't go out in the rain," he called out. "Please, Mary. Sarah, please." In the car, nobody spoke for a long time. Sarah watched her grandfather's house disappear behind them, thinking about storms that had happened long before she was born, about promises that couldn't be kept. "Dad," she finally asked, "what's a facility?" James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It's a place where people can get help when they need it. Special help. Like a hospital? Something like that? Sarah thought about her grandfather's green chair, about the sepia photographs on his walls, about the way his face lit up when he shared Mary's memories. Would he have to leave his house? Lisa turned in her seat. Sarah, honey, nothing's decided yet. We're just looking at options to help Grandpa be safe and comfortable. But he loves his chair, Sarah said. And his pictures. And the window where he watches for the mail. I know, Princess. James's voice was thick. I know. At home, Sarah went straight to her basement classroom. She stared at the neat rows of stuffed animals, at the equations she'd carefully written on the whiteboard. Playing teacher had felt like fun before. Now it felt heavier, weighted with her grandfather's memories and expectations. She picked up her favorite elephant student. What should I do? She whispered to it. Should I be Sarah? Or Mary? Or both? The elephant, of course, didn't answer. But as Sarah hugged it close, she thought she understood something about love and memory and the weight of wearing someone else's dreams that night. She dreamed of yellow dresses and rainstorms, of classroom apples and sepia photographs. In her dream, she stood in front of a class, but she couldn't tell if she was Sarah or Mary. Maybe her sleeping mind suggested that was the whole point. Chapter 5. The letters on Wednesday afternoon. James made an unexpected trip to his father's house. He found Sarah in her basement classroom. Want to come with me, Princess? Mrs. Martinez says Grandpa's having a good day. Sarah looked up from her whiteboard. But it's not Saturday. Sometimes we can visit on other days, too. James held out his hand. I need to pick up some paperwork, and I thought maybe you'd like to look through more of those old photos we found. The drive was quieter without Lisa there. Sarah watched the familiar streets pass, thinking about their last visit. Dad? Is Grandpa still going to remember Mary today? James sighed. Probably. But that's okay. We just need to be gentle with him, like always. They found Mr. Thompson in the kitchen with Mrs. Martinez, actually eating lunch. He looked up when they entered. James? Is it Saturday already? No, Dad. Just stopping by to get those insurance papers. And Sarah wanted to visit. Mr. Thompson's eyes found Sarah. Today they were clearer, more present. Sarah, my granddaughter. He smiled, and it was his real smile. Would you like a cookie? Mrs. Martinez made them fresh. Sarah sat at the kitchen table while James disappeared into his father's study. Mrs. Martinez placed a cookie and a glass of milk in front of her. He's been reading old letters all morning, the nurse whispered to Sarah. Having a really good day with his memories. Sure enough, scattered across the kitchen table were several envelopes, their edges worn soft with age. Sarah recognized Mary's handwriting. Can I read them? She asked her grandfather. Mr. Thompson pushed one letter closer to her. This one's from her first day of college. She was so excited. Sarah carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. Dearest Tommy, you wouldn't believe how big the university is. My dorm room's tiny, but my roommate Janet is nice. She's studying to be a teacher too. We stayed up all night talking about the kinds of teachers we want to be. I told her about how you used to let me practice teaching you, even when you'd rather be playing baseball. You were my first student, big brother, and still my favorite. Love always, Mary. Sarah looked up at her grandfather. You were a student? She taught me algebra, he said, smiling at the memory. Explain it better than my real teachers ever did. James returned with a folder full of papers, pausing in the doorway to watch this peaceful scene. His father hadn't seemed this lucid in weeks. There are more letters in the box, Mr. Thompson said. In the living room. Would you like to see them? Sarah nodded eagerly. They moved to the living room, where James retrieved the wooden box they'd found before. Mr. Thompson settled in his green chair, while Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully laying out the letters in chronological order, just like she'd learned in school. This one's from her teaching program, Mr. Thompson said, handing her another envelope. Dear Tommy, today I taught my first real lesson. My supervising teacher let me teach the kids about fractions. Remember how we used to practice with cookies, breaking them into pieces? I did that with my students today. One little girl, Amanda, was struggling until I showed her your cookie method. The look on her face when it finally made sense. That's why I want to teach, Tommy. That's the moment I've been dreaming of. I wish Mom could have seen me. Do you think she'd be proud? All my love. Mary. Sarah read letter after letter, each one full of Mary's dreams, her small victories, her plans for the future. Her grandfather added comments between each one, filling in details, painting a fuller picture of the Aunt Sarah had never known. She was going to change the world, Mr. Thompson said softly. One student at a time. Then Sarah found something at the bottom of the box, a teaching certificate, still sealed in its envelope, dated just 2 weeks before Mary's accident. She never got to see this, Mr. Thompson's voice cracked. It came in the mail after the storm. Sarah held the certificate carefully. She did it, though. She became a real teacher. Yes, Mr. Thompson whispered. Yes, she did. James watched as his daughter and father pored over Mary's letters, sharing this connection across generations. But he could see his father's energy starting to fade, the clarity in his eyes beginning to dim. Sarah, he said gently, we should let Grandpa rest soon. Sarah gathered the letters carefully, trying to return them to their original order. But Mr. Thompson stopped her. Take them, he said. Take them home with you. Mary would want you to have them. Really? Sarah looked at her father for permission. James nodded. We'll take good care of them, Dad. I promise. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Thompson called Sarah back. You remind me of her, you know. Not just how you look. Your heart. You have her heart. Sarah hugged him, gentle and quick. I'll bring the letters back next time, Grandpa. No rush, he said, his voice growing distant. Mary will be home soon. She's just at school, teaching her students. In the car, Sarah held the wooden box on her lap, feeling the weight of all those dreams and memories. Dad, did you know Aunt Mary used cookies to teach fractions? No, James smiled. But it sounds like something she would do. Could we buy cookies on the way home? I want to try teaching my stuffed animals like that. James glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. Sure, Princess. We can do that. That evening, Lisa found Sarah in the basement, surrounded by cookie pieces and stuffed animals. Having a good class? She asked. I'm teaching them fractions, Sarah explained. Like Aunt Mary did. See, if you break the cookie like this. Lisa watched her daughter teach, using the same method she'd read about in the letters. She saw shadows of Mary in Sarah's patience, in her joy when her students understood. Mom? Sarah asked later, as Lisa tucked her into bed. Do you think it makes Grandpa sad when I remind him of Aunt Mary? Lisa sat on the edge of the bed. I think you bring him joy, honey. Whether he sees you as Sarah or Mary, you bring him joy. That's what matters. But I want him to love me as me, Sarah whispered. Not just because I look like her. Oh, sweetheart. Lisa pulled her daughter close. He does love you for you. Even when he's confused, even when he sees Mary, that love is real. It's just complicated. Sarah thought about the letters downstairs, about all of Mary's dreams that never came true. Mom, is it okay if I want to be a teacher too? Not because of Aunt Mary, but because I really want to. Of course it's okay. You can be anything you want to be. After Lisa left, Sarah got out of bed and went to her desk. She took out her best paper and favorite pen and began to write. Dear Aunt Mary, I never met you, but I feel like I know you now. I read your letters today. You love teaching as much as I think I do. Grandpa misses you a lot. Sometimes he thinks I'm you, but I'm trying to understand that it's because he loved you so much. I'm going to be a teacher too someday. Not because you wanted to be one, but because it feels right in my heart. I'll use your cookie method to teach fractions, though. That was a really good idea. Love, your great niece Sarah. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box with Mary's letters. Maybe someday, she thought as she climbed back into bed, another little girl would find all these letters and understand this story of love and memory and dreams that lived on in unexpected ways. The next Saturday arrived with cold rain that drummed against the windows. Sarah stood in her room, staring at her closet. The yellow dress hung there, next to the blue one and the white one with flowers. She reached out, touching each one. Sarah? Lisa called up the stairs. We need to leave in 20 minutes. I can't decide what to wear, Sarah called back. She heard her mother's footsteps on the stairs. Then Lisa appeared in the doorway. What's wrong, honey? If I wear yellow, Grandpa will think I'm Mary. If I don't wear yellow, he might get sad. Sarah's voice trembled. I don't know who to be today. Lisa knelt beside her daughter. You be Sarah. Just Sarah. But Sarah shook her head. Sometimes being Sarah makes Grandpa cry. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Lisa pulled Sarah into a tight hug, feeling her daughter's shoulders shake with silent sobs. I heard Dad talking about the facility, Sarah whispered in her mother's shoulder. Is Grandpa going away because of me? No, honey, no. Lisa pulled back, wiping Sarah's tears. This isn't because of you. Grandpa needs more help than we can give him at home. But none of this is your fault. Sarah sniffled. Can I wear my school uniform today? It's not yellow or blue or white. It's just clothes. Of course you can. The drive to Grandpa Thompson's house was tense. The rain made everything gray, and Sarah watched water stream across her window, thinking about storms and promises and roads that weren't safe. James pulled into the driveway, but didn't turn off the engine immediately. Maybe we should wait, he said, watching the rain. He gets more agitated in bad weather. We can't avoid the rain forever, Lisa said softly. He needs to see us. They ran from the car to the front door, Sarah holding her jacket over her head. Mrs. Martinez opened the door before they could knock. It's been a difficult morning, she warned. The storm, it triggers memories. They found Mr. Thompson pacing in front of his window. He'd pulled all the photographs off the walls, and they lay scattered on every surface. Dad? James stepped forward. What are you doing? I have to find it, Mr. Thompson muttered. The last photo. The one from her classroom. She was wearing yellow that day. Always yellow. He turned and saw Sarah in her navy blue school uniform. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Mary? Then no. Sarah? His hands trembled. I can't remember. Sarah stepped forward. It's Sarah, Grandpa. Your granddaughter. Sarah, he repeated. Then he looked out at the rain again. But Mary's out there. In the storm. I have to find her before... Dad, Mary's not out there, James said firmly. Mary's been gone for 30 years. No. Mr. Thompson's voice rose sharply. No, she was just here, teaching her students. She sent me a letter. He began searching through the scattered photographs again. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding. She thought about the wooden box of letters at home, about the teaching certificate that came too late, about all the dreams that ended in a rainstorm 30 years ago. Grandpa, she said quietly. I'm not Mary. He stopped moving, staring at her. I'm Sarah. I'm 6 years old. I like teaching like Mary did, but I'm not her. Her voice grew stronger. I have her letters at home. She was amazing. But she's gone, Grandpa. I'm sorry, but she's gone. The room went silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Mr. Thompson sank into his green chair, his face crumpling. Gone, he whispered. My little sister, gone? Sarah moved to his side, taking his hand. But you told me about her. You shared her letters. You kept her memories safe. Memories, he repeated. Sometimes I can't tell what's memory and what's now. You look so much like her. When you smile, when you talk about teaching. I know. Sarah squeezed his hand. But I want you to see me too. Just Sarah, your granddaughter who loves you. Mr. Thompson touched her face with trembling fingers. Sarah, he said clearly. My James's little girl. Yes, but sometimes when I look at you, it's okay, Sarah said. Sometimes I can be both. Your granddaughter and her memory. Is that okay? Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. You're so wise for such a little thing. Mary was like that too. Always wise beyond her years. James and Lisa watched this exchange in stunned silence. They'd never heard Sarah speak so directly about the situation before. I've been practicing teaching, Sarah told her grandfather. In my basement. I use cookies to teach fractions like Mary did. Want me to show you? Mrs. Martinez appeared with a package of cookies she'd baked that morning. Sarah took them to the kitchen table, arranging them carefully. See, if you break it like this, she demonstrated, just as Mary had described in her letters. Mr. Thompson watched, really watched, seeing both the echo of his sister's teaching method and his granddaughter's unique way of explaining things. You're a natural teacher, he said softly. Like she was, but your own way too. They spent the next hour with cookies and mathematics, the rain forgotten. Sarah taught, Mr. Thompson listened, and somewhere between memory and present moment, they found a new way to be together. But storm clouds couldn't be held at bay forever. As thunder rumbled outside, Mr. Thompson's clarity began to fade. "Mary shouldn't drive in this," he muttered. The roads get so slick." "Dad," James said gently, "let's get you to bed. It's been a big day." As Mrs. Martinez helped him to his bedroom, Mr. Thompson looked back at Sarah. "You'll be careful in the rain? Promise me?" "I promise, Grandpa," Sarah said. "We'll all be careful." In the car ride home, Sarah was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. She watched the rain, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. "You did good today, Princess," James said softly. "Really good," Lisa agreed. "How did you know what to say to him?" Sarah thought about it. "I just said what was true. I'm me. But part of me reminds him of Mary, and that's okay too. We can share her memory without me having to be her." At home, Sarah went to the wooden box of letters. She took out the one she'd written to Mary and added a P.S. P.S. "I helped Grandpa today. He was scared of the rain, but we did fraction lessons with cookies, and he smiled. I think he saw both of us today, you and his memories, and me right here. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Love." Sarah, that night, as the storm passed and the stars came out, Sarah dreamed of teaching again. But this time, in her dream, she wasn't wearing yellow or blue or white. She was just wearing her own smile, teaching in her own way, carrying a legacy without being bound by it. And somewhere, she hoped Mary was smiling too. The decision about the facility came on a Tuesday. Sarah overheard her parents talking in the kitchen after they thought she'd gone to bed. "It's the best place in Portland," James was saying. "They specialize in memory care. Dad would have his own room, with space for his chair." "When?" Lisa asked softly. 2 weeks. They have an opening for the 15th. Sarah crept back upstairs, her mind racing. 2 weeks. 2 more Saturdays with Grandpa in his house, with the sepia photographs and the stories and the memories that drifted like autumn leaves. The next morning, she went to her closet and pulled out every dress she owned. She laid them on her bed. The yellow one, the blue one, the white one with flowers, her school uniform, and all the others. She studied them for a long time. "Mom," she called, "can you help me with something?" Lisa found her daughter, surrounded by dresses. "What's going on, honey?" "I need to give these away," Sarah said, pointing to most of the dresses. "But I want to keep some too. Can you help me choose?" Together, they sorted through the clothes. The yellow dress went into a donation box without hesitation. The blue one too. Sarah kept her school uniform, the white dress with flowers, and a few others she'd picked out herself. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa asked. Sarah nodded. "I want Grandpa to see me, the real me, before he goes to the new place." That Saturday, Sarah wore a purple dress she'd chosen herself. It had pockets and allowed her to sit cross-legged comfortably, perfect for teaching. When they arrived at Grandpa Thompson's house, they found Mrs. Martinez supervising as he packed books into boxes. "Just sorting through some things," she explained quietly. "The facility said he can bring personal items." Sarah watched her grandfather pick up each book, examine it, and either place it carefully in a box or set it aside. His movements were methodical, almost peaceful. "Grandpa," she said softly. He turned. Today his eyes were clear, present. "Sarah." He smiled, then looked at her dress. "Purple. That's new. I like purple," she said. "It's my favorite color." "Not yellow?" "No. Yellow was Mary's favorite. Purple is mine." Mr. Thompson sat in his green chair, patting the arm for her to join him. "Tell me about why you like purple." Sarah climbed up, feeling the familiar worn fabric under her legs. "It's the color of twilight, when the sky can't decide if it's day or night. And grape popsicles. And the flowers in our backyard." "Good reasons," he nodded. "Mary never liked purple. Said it was too royal for her. You remember that? Some things stay clear, even when others get foggy." He looked at her carefully. "You're wearing your hair different, too." Sarah touched her braids. "Mom did them this morning. Do you like them?" "They suit you." "Very, Sarah." Those 2 words made her heart swell. She reached into one of her dress pockets and pulled out a folded paper. "I wrote something. Can I read it to you?" Mr. Thompson settled back in his chair. "Of course." Sarah unfolded the paper carefully. Her handwriting was neat, practiced. She'd worked hard on it in her basement classroom. Dear Grandpa, she began reading. I know you're going to a new place soon. Mom and Dad say it's to help you with your memories. I want you to know something before you go. I'm not Mary. I know sometimes you see her when you look at me, and that's okay. She was amazing. I read her letters and learned about her dreams, but I'm Sarah, your granddaughter. And I have my own dreams too. She paused, glancing up. Mr. Thompson was watching her intently, his eyes clear and focused. I want to be a teacher like Mary wanted to be, but I'll teach my own way, with purple dresses and braids, and maybe sometimes cookies for fractions, because that was a really good idea. I love you, Grandpa, and I want you to see me. Just me. Love, Sarah. The room was quiet when she finished. She could hear Mrs. Martinez moving boxes in the other room, her parents talking softly in the kitchen. Just you, Mr. Thompson repeated softly. Sarah Johnson. My granddaughter. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the boxes of books, at the spaces on the walls where photographs had hung. I'm sorry, he finally said, for the times I've confused you with her. It's not fair to you. It's okay, Sarah said. I understand now. Mary was special to you. Yes, she was. But you're special too, Sarah. In your own way. He touched one of her braids gently. Purple suits you better than yellow ever would. Sarah pulled another paper from her pocket. I brought something else too. Look, it was a photograph. Not sepia-toned like the ones on his walls, but bright and clear. It showed Sarah in her basement classroom, teaching her stuffed animals about fractions using cookies. Mrs. Martinez took it last week when she visited, Sarah explained. I thought maybe you could take it with you? To the new place? Mr. Thompson took the photo with trembling hands. My granddaughter, the teacher, he said softly. You're Sarah, she corrected gently. My Sarah, he agreed. They spent the rest of the morning going through his books together. Sarah helped him choose which ones to take, listening as he told stories about each one. Sometimes he'd start to drift, calling her Mary or getting lost in old memories. But she'd gently remind him, it's Sarah, Grandpa. In the purple dress. As the morning wore on, Mrs. Martinez brought them cookies and milk. Sarah automatically began breaking one into fractions. See, Grandpa, if you break it like this, you can see how the pieces make a whole, he finished. Mary taught me that. Then he caught himself. And now you're teaching it your way. With purple crumbs, Sarah giggled as bits of cookies scattered on her dress. James and Lisa watched from the doorway as their daughter and her grandfather laughed together over broken cookies and mathematics. They saw the way Sarah gently guided him back when he started to drift, how she created her own space in his complicated world of memories. When it was time to leave, Sarah hugged her grandfather tightly. We'll visit you in a new place, she promised. I'll bring more pictures of my classroom. Purple dress? He asked. Purple dress, she confirmed. And maybe some new colors too. We'll make new memories, Grandpa. In the car, Sarah watched his house disappear behind them. She didn't feel sad exactly. Something else filled her heart. Something that felt like growth, like understanding. Mom, she asked, can we go shopping for more dresses? I want to try green next. And maybe red? Lisa smiled. Of course, honey. Any color you want. At home, Sarah went to her basement classroom. She took down the old whiteboard and asked her father to help her paint the wall. They chose a shade of purple that reminded her of twilight. That night, as Lisa tucked her into bed, Sarah said something that made her mother pause. I used to think I had to choose between being Sarah and being Mary's memory. But today I figured it out. I can be me and still carry her story. Like how a cookie can be broken into pieces but still be one whole cookie. Lisa kissed her daughter's forehead. When did you get so wise? Grandpa says it runs in the family, Sarah smiled. Mary had it, and now I have it too. But my way is purple instead of yellow. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah thought about the facility where her grandfather would soon live. She imagined his green chair in a new room, her bright photograph on his wall next to Mary's sepia ones. Different pieces of the same story, she thought. Different colors in the same heart. Moving day arrived with autumn sunshine. Sarah watched from her parents. Car as movers carried her grandfather's green chair into Sunrise Memory Care. The facility looked nothing like a hospital, more like a large house with lots of windows and a garden. Ready? James asked, turning off the engine. Sarah nodded, clutching a small bag. Inside was a new photograph for her grandfather's room, taken yesterday in her purple-walled classroom. They found Mr. Thompson in his new room, directing the movers about where to place his chair. The space was smaller than his living room at home, but sunlight streamed through a large window, and there was a small bookshelf already filled with his favorite volumes. "The light's wrong," he was saying. "The chair needs to face the window, like at home." "We can fix that, Dad," James stepped in. "Let's try it over here." Sarah stood in the doorway, taking in the new space. The walls were cream-colored, bare except for two photographs, Mary's graduation picture and the one of Sarah teaching fractions to her stuffed animals. "What do you think, Grandpa?" she asked. "About your new room?" Mr. Thompson turned at her voice. Today was a clear day. She could tell by the way his eyes focused immediately. "Sarah," he smiled, "you're wearing green today." She smoothed down her new dress. "I thought it matched the trees outside your window." "So it does." He settled into his chair once the movers had positioned it correctly. "Will you help me arrange my books? My eyes aren't what they used to be." Sarah spent the next hour organizing his small library, reading out titles and listening to his stories about each book. Some were Mary's old textbooks, some were his favorites from years of reading, and one special volume was a photo album Mrs. Martinez had helped them create. "Look at this one." Sarah opened the album. "It's from last week, when we had cookies in your kitchen." Mr. Thompson studied the photograph. "You were teaching fractions, like Mary taught you, but with your own style," he added. "Very Sarah." A nurse appeared in the doorway. Not Mrs. Martinez, but a kind-faced woman named Jenny. "Time for lunch, Mr. Thompson," she announced. "Would you and your family like to eat in the dining room, or here in your room?" Mr. Thompson looked uncertain, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Maybe in here today," Lisa suggested. "While we finish unpacking." Sarah helped Jenny set up a small table by the window. The nurse brought them sandwiches, fruit, and cookies, chocolate chip like the ones they use for fraction lessons. "The cookies here aren't as good as Mrs. Martinez's," Mr. Thompson said after taking a bite. "But they'll do for teaching." "Are there other kids here?" Sarah asked, looking out at the garden where some residents sat in wheelchairs. "No, honey," Lisa explained. "This is a place for older people who need special care." "But there's a school 3 blocks away," Jenny added. "Sometimes they bring students to visit and read to our residents." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Really? Could I come read too?" "That's a wonderful idea," Jenny smiled. "We have a volunteer program for families." They spent the afternoon helping Mr. Thompson settle in. Sarah arranged his photographs just so, placing Mary's graduation picture next to her classroom photo, bridging past and present on his wall. But as the day wore on, she noticed her grandfather becoming more confused. The new surroundings seemed to disorient him. "Mary," he called suddenly. "Mary, where did you put my books?" "It's Sarah, Grandpa," she said gently. "Remember? In the green dress today. The books are right here on your shelf." He stared at her, then at the bookshelf, then back at her. "Green," he repeated. "Not yellow." "That's right, Sarah," he said clearly. "My granddaughter Sarah." She rewarded him with a bright smile. "Want to do some fractions before we go?" They broke cookies into halves and quarters until the sun began to set. Jenny came back to remind them about dinner time. "Will you come back?" Mr. Thompson asked as they prepared to leave. "Every Saturday," Sarah promised. "And maybe sometimes after school to read with the other kids." "Green dress?" "Maybe green, maybe purple, maybe a new color." She hugged him gently. "But always Sarah." That night at home, Sarah asked for paper and markers. In her now purple classroom, she began making signs. "Welcome to Miss Sarah's Reading Corner. Books make us smile. Reading is magic." "What are those for?" Lisa asked from the doorway. "For when I read at Grandpa's new place," Sarah explained. "Jenny said kids come to read to the people there. I want to make it special." "You're really okay with all this change?" Sarah considered the question as she colored in her letters. "Grandpa needs help remembering things. This new place has people who know how to help him. And now we can visit and make new memories." Over the next few weeks, they established a new routine. Saturday mornings were still for visiting. But now Sarah also went on Wednesday afternoons with her mother to read to the residents. She brought new photographs each week, Her classroom with its purple walls, her reading corner at the facility where other students had started joining her, moments captured in bright color that she added to her grandfather's album. Sometimes Mr. Thompson still called her Mary, especially on foggy days when his memories swirled like autumn leaves. But now Sarah knew how to navigate those moments. "Tell me about her," she'd say. "What was Mary like when she was teaching?" And he'd share stories, his eyes far away but his voice strong, until something would bring him back to the present. Sarah's green dress, or purple walls in a photograph, or the sound of children reading in the common room. "You're doing good work here," Jenny told her one Wednesday. "Not just with your grandfather. All our residents look forward to reading time now." Sarah beamed at the praise. "I like teaching them. Even when they forget things, they still smile at the stories." She found her grandfather in the garden that afternoon. His green chair moved outside to catch the late summer sun. "Ready for our book, Grandpa?" She held up Charlotte's Web. They were 3 chapters in. "Is it time for class?" he asked, slightly confused. "Story time," she corrected gently. "Remember? We're reading about Wilbur the pig." "Ah, yes." He settled back in his chair. "You do the voices so well." Like Mary did?" "No," he said, surprising her. "Like Sarah does." "My Sarah." She opened the book, her heart full. Around them, other residents gathered in their wheelchairs and chairs, drawn by the promise of a story. Sarah cleared her throat and began to read. The autumn sun painted everything gold, not yellow. A new color for new memories. In his green chair, Mr. Thompson closed his eyes and listened to his granddaughter's voice, clear and strong, telling a story that was entirely her own. 3 months passed at Sunrise Memory Care. December brought snow to Portland, dusting the facility's garden in white. Sarah pressed her nose against the car window as they pulled into the parking lot, watching residents and staff build a small snowman near the entrance. "Look what I brought, Mom." Sarah pulled a bright red scarf from her backpack. "For the snowman." Today she wore a warm winter dress in deep burgundy, paired with thick black tights and boots. Her reading group had grown to 15 students from the nearby elementary school, and together they'd planned a special holiday story time. Inside, they found Mr. Thompson in the common room rather than his usual spot. He sat in his green chair, which had been moved near the Christmas tree, surrounded by other residents. "Grandpa," Sarah called out, "we brought hot chocolate." He turned at her voice, his eyes focusing slowly. "Sarah?" "Then more certainly, Sarah. My teaching girl." She hugged him carefully, mindful of the cup of hot chocolate he held. "Ready for story time? We brought something special today." The other students began arriving, stamping snow from their boots. Each carried a book and wore a Santa hat. Sarah had organized everything: the books, the hot chocolate, even the small battery-operated candles that created a cozy atmosphere. "Before we start," Sarah announced to the room, "I have a surprise. Remember how I told you about my Aunt Mary? How she used to teach? Well, I found something special in Grandpa's old boxes." She pulled out a worn book, a collection of Christmas stories with Mary's name written inside the cover. This was her favorite, Sarah explained. She used to read it to her students. "So today, we're going to read it together." Mr. Thompson leaned forward in his chair. "Mary's book?" "Yes, Grandpa. But we're reading it the Sarah way." She had divided the story into parts, assigning different students to read different characters. They'd practiced all week at school. As the children began to read, something magical happened. The residents, many of whom struggled with memory, like Mr. Thompson, sat straighter in their chairs. Some mouthed the familiar words along with the students. Mr. Thompson watched Sarah direct her little reading group, his eyes clear and present. When it was her turn to read, she did the voices just as she always did. Not Mary's way, but her own. After the story, as the other students handed out cookies and candy canes, James pulled his father aside. "Dad, we need to talk about something important." He sat next to the green chair. "Sarah's teacher told us about a special program at her school. They're starting a college fund for promising students interested in education." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. We found Mary's old savings account," James continued. "The one she was using for teaching supplies. It's been gathering interest for 30 years. "Mary's money," Mr. Thompson said clearly. "Yes. We thought, well, We thought maybe we could use it to start Sarah's college fund for her teaching degree. If you agree." Mr. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, watching Sarah organize her reading group for another story. "She wears burgundy," he said suddenly. "What? Not yellow. Not trying to be Mary. Being Sarah." He turned to his son. "Yes. Use the money. Mary would have wanted that." Across the room, Sarah felt the weight of their gaze. She looked up from her book, meeting her grandfather's eyes. He smiled, his real smile, the one that meant he was fully present. "Miss Sarah," one of her reading group students tugged at her dress. "Can we do another story?" "Of course. Which one would you like?" The afternoon passed in a warm blur of stories, hot chocolate, and Christmas carols. As the other students began to leave, Sarah noticed her grandfather had dozed off in his chair. "He really loved it," Jenny said softly. "I haven't seen him this engaged in months." Sarah carefully tucked a blanket around his shoulders. On the wall behind his chair, someone had hung a new photograph, Sarah in her burgundy dress, reading to her group, her face animated as she did the voices. "Sarah?" Mr. Thompson stirred, blinking awake. "Is it time for class?" "Story time is over, Grandpa. But I'll be back on Saturday." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You know, Mary would be proud of you." "Really?" "Yes. But not because you remind me of her." He touched her burgundy dress. "Because you're you. My Sarah. Teaching your own way." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I love you, Grandpa. I love you too. Teaching girl." That night at home, Sarah sat at her desk with Mary's book of Christmas stories. She opened to the inside cover, where Mary's signature faded after 30 years. Below it, she carefully wrote, "December 2024 now, being read the Sarah way, with love and respect for those who taught before me." Sarah Johnson, age 6 and 3/4, she'd added the and 3/4 part because fractions were important in their family story. The next morning, Sarah asked her mother for craft supplies. In her purple classroom, she created a special album. On the cover, she wrote "Teaching runs in the family" in her best handwriting. The first page held Mary's graduation photo and teaching certificate. The second showed Sarah's reading group at sunrise. The pages that followed were blank. Room for future memories, future students, future stories. She thought about the college fund, about the long path ahead to becoming a real teacher. But she wasn't trying to finish Mary's story anymore. She was writing her own. The next Saturday, she wore a brand new dress, rainbow-colored, because she didn't have to choose just one anymore. She found her grandfather in his usual spot by the window, his green chair catching the winter sunlight. "Ready for today's lesson, Grandpa?" He looked at her dress and smiled. "Always ready, teaching girl." And so Sarah Johnson, age 6 3/4, daughter of James and Lisa, granddaughter of Mr. Thompson, great-niece of Mary, but most importantly, herself, opened her book and began to read. In the years that would follow, the residents of Sunrise Memory Care would tell stories about the little girl who brought reading to life every Wednesday and Saturday. They might forget what they had for breakfast or what year it was, but they remembered the sound of her voice, the rainbow of her dresses, and the way she could guide them gently back to the present moment when their minds wandered too far into the past. Mr. Thompson's memories continued to fade like photographs left in the sun. But some things remained clear. The feeling of his green chair beneath him, the sound of children reading, and the sight of his granddaughter. Not in yellow, not in Mary's shadow, but in every color of the rainbow, teaching her own way. And somewhere, in a corner of his heart where the most precious memories lived, he held both images. Mary in her yellow dress, dreams still ahead of her, and Sarah in her rainbow of colors, making those dreams come true in her own unique way. The wooden box of letters still sat in Sarah's room, but now it held new stories too. Stories of Wednesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, of hot chocolate and Christmas tales, of a little girl who learned that carrying someone's memory didn't mean losing yourself. Instead, she discovered that love was like those fraction cookies they shared. It could be divided again and again, but somehow it only grew larger with each breaking. Sarah kept teaching at Sunrise through elementary school, middle school, and high school. The college fund grew, Mary's savings multiplied by years of interest and new contributions. By the time she graduated and headed off to study education, her reading group had inspired dozens of other students to volunteer. They say if you visit Sunrise Memory Care even now, you can still find Mr. Thompson's green chair by the window. These days it holds other residents, other grandparents with fading memories. But every Wednesday and Saturday, children come to read stories, carrying on the legacy of a little girl who learned to be herself while honoring those who came before. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson Sarah Johnson ever taught. That love and memory and identity aren't fractions to be divided, but whole numbers that multiply with sharing. Just like she always said in her lessons, sometimes the most important math is done with the heart.